Hey everybody! So in this video I'm going to go over the PowerPoint on A Rose for Emily, which was one of the short stories that you were asked to read for homework last week. The questions that you had to answer after reading the short story were a little more general in nature, and so in this PowerPoint and video we are going to go through some of the more specifics of the story. And of course we're going to look at the structure, the imagery and the symbolism, the point of view, the setting and atmosphere, and the themes. Not necessarily in that order, but we are going to go through all of them. So, A Rose for Emily. If you struggled to read the story and understand what was happening, first of all, don't feel bad, because it's a bit of a strange story. I think another thing that makes it hard to know for sure if you truly understood it is because the story itself is so bizarre that you finish reading it and you're like, I had to have missed something. There's no way that that's what really happened. So if you found yourself thinking that, you were actually probably right, that it really is what happened. Because what we come to find out, of course, is that Miss Emily is a bit of a character in this town, and she and her family have a long history in the town and a bit of a reputation. They were sort of seen as being, probably back in the day, before Emily was born and in her youth, her family was probably well respected. They were affluent. I don't want to say they were aristocracy, but that's kind of a somewhat good comparison. So they had money, they had status, and they were sort of like an image of the town, but that didn't stay the way, it changed as time went on after her father died, and for various reasons, Miss Emily sort of became more of someone that the townspeople didn't understand, didn't bother to try to understand, really. They kind of pitied her, but not in a compassionate way, more of in a looking down upon her way. And it was almost like it gave them pleasure to be able to look down on her because of how much status and respect her family once had. So they got to see sort of the fall of the Grierson family name, and the pity was not coming from a very benevolent place. Her father made it very hard for her to date when she was in her youth. We're not 100% sure why, but certainly he was an obstacle that was between her and finding a husband. Of course, during the late 1800s, early 1900s, being a single woman was looked down upon. And then after her father dies, she finally meets a guy, and it would have been a man that her family never would have approved of. The townspeople themselves really didn't approve of Homer. Not only was he self-admittedly not the marrying type, which means he had no intentions of ever making a commitment, and therefore kind of played the field, right? She was also a northerner, which was a sin against sins during the South in this time, and she didn't care. And probably at one point in her life she would have cared very much. I think it would be interesting to know what would have happened had Homer shown up in town while her father was still alive, and when she was a little bit younger, like say early 20s. Would she have given him the time of day? My guess is no, but I could be wrong. But certainly at that point in time, she was very much willing to give him the time of day, and they were sort of a couple. The townspeople came to see this, and while they didn't really approve, at the same time they were kind of happy that Emily seemed to be doing something somewhat normal and able to, you know, at least find some semblance of happiness. And then they start to get more worried because it seems like things are getting more serious between Emily and Homer, but there doesn't seem to be any kind of marriage happening, and they don't want her to be a fallen woman, a disgraced woman. They don't want the town to have any type of bad reputation or bad gossip happening around. So they intervene and they get her family, her cousins, to come intervene on Emily's behalf to sort of resolve this situation. My guess is either you guys either get married or you've got to go. And while they're there, we learned that Emily buys like a man's toilet set, so like those personal items and men's clothing, and it appears as though she's preparing for some sort of them living together and getting married. She also buys some rat poison during that time. The cousins leave. They seem to be happy with how things have been resolved. The town just assumes that Emily and Homer either have already married in secret or in private, not really secret, but in private, or that they are about to be married. The cousins leave. Homer goes back into the house, and he's never seen again. Never seen or heard from again. And Miss Emily herself is not seen or heard from again very often after that. A little bit after this, there is a very bad odor, very horrible smell coming from the Grierson house. And the townspeople do not feel that it is appropriate. They feel like it would be disrespectful to confront Emily about it. So in secret, they sprinkle lime all around the property and the foundation of the house to cover up the odor. And it works. And more time goes by. They want to get her to start paying her taxes again, and she refuses. She's very obstinate. And then she dies. And after her death, the townspeople, at least some of them, enter the Grierson home, and they go upstairs, and they break down the door to the bedroom, and they find Homer's corpse lying in the bed. And if that wasn't bad enough, the other side of the bed had a clear indentation as though someone had been sleeping there on a regular basis, and there was a long strand of gray hair on the pillow next to Homer's rotting corpse, which I'm sure at this point was already completely rotted. It was probably just bones, because it had been 40-something years at this point. So not only did she apparently kill him, but then she left his body in a reposed state on the other side of her bed and slept next to him, for what we can presume was all 40-something years after he had died. And that is some crazy stuff. So if you thought you didn't understand what was happening because there's just no way that could have been what was really happening, that is what was really happening. There are other reasons, though, that you might have been confused. And another big reason why the story is not easy to follow is because of the structure. It might not pop out at you right away when you first start reading the story, but the further you get into it, the more you might start to realize that the events that are being shared with us are not being told in chronological order. This narrator begins with Emily's death, right? Then takes us into the not-so-distant past, and then goes back further into the past, and then comes back, not quite as far as we were before, but, somewhere in the middle, And then the end of the story actually happens after Emily's death. So the timeline is crazy. And you really have to pay attention to the details um, to kind of piece it all together, because it's very disjointed and out of order. So let's look at the true chronology of the events in the story. And that's on slide 3. So, Emily is born around 1864. There's some debate over the exact year, but it's around that time. Her father dies when she is 30, right? Shortly after that, Colonel Sartoris, the previous mayor, or the mayor at that time, he suspends Emily's property taxes out of sympathy and pity, because all her father left her was the house. She has no money, basically. So she doesn't have to pay those property taxes. And it's pretty much like a indefinite thing. Like, you don't ever have to pay them again. Shortly after that, Homer Barron comes to town, right? He and his company are doing work on the sidewalks. They are essentially trying to update the town, make the town more modern, if you will. Modern for that time, not our time. So he courts Miss Emily, and they are sort of seen as a couple riding around town together, and the town gossips about them a lot. It sort of seems to be a very weird fascination and obsession for the townspeople, at least according to the narrator. Townspeople send for Emily's cousins because they're worried about her relationship with Homer. While the cousins are in town, Emily buys the man's toilet set, the men's clothing, and the poison, and then Homer leaves town. Everybody thinks that either the relationship has broken off, or more likely, he is going home to either prepare his home for Emily to join him there, or to get his affairs in order to then come back and marry Emily and live there in her house. Alright? The cousins leave. Everybody seems to be satisfied with these arrangements. And after 3 days, Homer returns to the Grierson house and is never seen again. Shortly after that is when the horrible smell envelops the Grierson house and property. The townspeople sprinkle lime around the house to mitigate the stench, and it works. Shortly after this, Emily begins giving china painting lessons, which lasts about 6 or 7 years. The china painting lessons stop, and after that, Emily is scarcely seen or heard from after that. So, let's think about this. Let's say she's born in 1864. Her father died when she was 30. So that would put the year at 1894. She meets Homer right after that. And I think there's a reference like that it's about a year that she and Homer have this thing going. Maybe not quite that long. They call the cousins are there for a little bit, and then they leave, and we never see Homer again either. So that can't be more than, let's see, so 1894, 1895, 1896, right? So Emily's like 32 years old-ish when she kills Homer. Alright? So 32, 33 years old. After he's dead and the townspeople sprinkle the lime and the smell goes away, she gives china painting lessons for about 6 or 7 years, so we'll just put her at 40 at that point. She doesn't die until she's 74. So for 30-something years after she gave those china painting lessons, she is scarcely seen or heard from after that. 8 to 10 years, so when she's about 50, the new leaders of the town want to try to start collecting taxes from her again. So her taxes are remitted, but she still refuses to pay them. She keeps saying that the men should speak to Colonel Sartoris, who has been long dead at this point. And then that's sort of like the last bit of interaction that we hear about. So during that 30-something years, between the china painting lessons and her death, we only get like one real encounter with her. That's extreme. So she dies at age 74, and a few days later, that's when the townspeople go into the room and discover his corpse and the gray hair on the pillow next to him. Now, when you line it up like that, everything seems clear, right? Um, when you read the story as it is, when you read the part about the smell and how they sprinkled the lime, you might not really think to wonder why the smell was there, or you know, why are they mentioning this to us? Because there's so many random details throughout the whole story that you don't know what's important and what's not. Um, so it's easy to read that about the smell and the timing of it, because that's not super clear either. It's not super clear that the smell starts happening shortly after Homer comes back and is never seen from again. Um, so the story takes a lot of uh, scenic routes, a lot of twists and turns and wrong ways, and doubles back quite a bit. So why write it that way? Why is it so disjointed and fractured? The first and obvious answer would be that if the story had been told in chronological order, we would have realized everything right away as it was being shared with us. There would have been no mystery, no real hook to keep us reading. But there's more to it than just keeping our interest or keeping us on our toes. The first thing that the structure does is it sort of causes the past and the present to intersect and merge, almost as if they coexist. Almost as if talking about the present necessitates bringing the past in as well. It urges us to consider how the past shapes the present. And it sort of reminds us that while we only live in the present literally, we are all very much still living a part of the past as well. Another thing is it makes us consider versions of reality. All right, so we have objective reality, where time is fixed and it is linear. It moves forward and it continues to move forward. Time doesn't stop. But a subjective reality is where you're not necessarily following whatever the reality that everybody else follows. Subjective means that it is susceptible to personal interpretation. So a subjective reality, time outside is still moving forward, but the past can still be an element of the present. And if you look at Emily, she gives us plenty of examples of this. She chooses to live in that subjective reality. The world around her continues to move forward. Life moves on. But she does not. She refuses to. She holds on to the past and roots herself in the past. And it's almost like everything else just grows up and wild around her. And then she's just sort of cocooned in this house that, she creates that subjective reality in. And we'll get to that a little bit more. Let's talk about the point of view as well, okay? So we have a second person narrator. A second person narrator, remember, is someone who is not a main character in the story, but was present for the events. They don't have access to the main character's thoughts and feelings, only their actions and dialogue and their own personal sort of interpretations of what the main characters are thinking and feeling. And in this case, it's not a single person, it is a collective we that is being used. So it's almost like the narrator is speaking on behalf of the whole town, of all the townspeople. So that narrator can only report what they witnessed, but nothing about what happens in the Grierson home, unless someone from the town was in the house and then able to share that event with the rest of the townspeople. Then it's almost like a game of telephone, right? So if you have someone who went into the Grierson house and had this interaction with Miss Emily and then leaves the house and goes to tell the town about it, we only have their side of the story. So we have no idea what really happened. But yet the townspeople are going to rely on that information to form opinions about Miss Emily. Interesting. They cannot report. There's nothing that the narrator can tell us about what Miss Emily thinks or feels. It's only guesses. It's only, theories. And what's really weird is that we get this collective we throughout the whole story, as if the narrator is the voice of the town, until the very end, when they break down the door to the bedroom. And then all of a sudden it changes, and the narrator refers to the townspeople as they instead of we. Almost like they're trying to distance themselves from that particular moment. Like, the narrator is perfectly fine being a part of the gossip that happens throughout Emily's life. They're perfectly fine being a part of all that. But breaking down the door and finding the dead body and the gray hair was like, oh, nope, you all have crossed the line. I am not a part of that. Why? There's some theories as to who the narrator actually is. A lot of people think it's Toby, the servant, whoever. I don't know. He's just a servant because he takes on so many roles. He was probably sort of more of a kind of a butler or just like a house person. Just the servant that ran the errands and stuff like that. Who knows what he did when he was a little girl. But certainly, once her father dies and she sort of isolates herself within the house, Toby is the one that keeps it all together. He's the one that keeps things running in the Grierson house and is probably the one very much taking care of Miss Emily. So a lot of people think that the narrator is Toby. And that, he didn't necessarily have a problem explaining what the townspeople thought about Miss Emily, what their assumptions were throughout her life, but to break down that door to her private bedroom, even after she was dead, that might explain why the narrator was not okay with that part. Toby might have had a problem with that. But that's just one theory. Who knows if it was really Toby. It's an interesting theory, though. But let's look really more about the effects of using that collective narrator, that collective we. It helps disperse the blame. This town is not very nice to Miss Emily. They don't go out of their way to be mean or cruel to her, but they do absolutely nothing to try to help her or understand her. They pity her, but they don't show any real compassion for her. It's almost like she's just a nuisance, just a fixture within the town that everybody has to deal with, and she's really odd and strange, and who would want to go talk to her or check on her or make any effort to have some sort of friendship or relationship with her. So they didn't really do right by Miss Emily as an elder in the town. So it helps disperse the blame, right? If it's we're not just pointing fingers at any one person or group of people. And it's a lot more difficult to punish or condemn a group than it is individuals. Um, Also, that collective we, that second person narrator, it makes it easier to create the mystery and suspense, because if the narrator has no access to what's going on in the Grierson house, then it remains a mystery until the very end, right? Um, so it's a very practical use of the narrator. Um, and not only, so not having access to Emily's thoughts or feelings, that also aids in developing the mystery, but it also prevents us from empathizing with her too much, you know? We do feel sorry for her, I'm sure. And maybe to a certain extent we can even understand her actions, but we are also very much appalled by them. I mean, it's horrible. The thought of, not just the thought of actually killing someone, but the thought of then keeping that corpse beside you in your bed for 40 something years, I'm sure is just, we cannot even, right? But yet, we do feel a certain amount of empathy and pity for her. But not knowing, was she truly insane? I mean, she had to have been to a certain extent, right? Right? Or was she? I don't know. But because we don't know, we cannot connect with her. So we are left with a certain amount of pity and compassion, but also just totally appalled and disgusted by it. Faulkner wanted us to feel both of them. He wanted us to see Miss Emily as that sort of poor, unfortunate soul. But he also wanted us to be completely disgusted and terrified by what she did. Going back to that switch from the we to they towards the end of the story, maybe the narrator wasn't on board with them breaking down the doors because, you know, it was just another way for the townspeople to satisfy a morbid curiosity. And yet they had done nothing to truly try to help her, or just be kind to her. Nothing was done that could have prevented that kind of tragedy from happening. And who's to say that it could have been prevented? Miss Emily was a very stubborn, obstinate woman. If she had it in her mind that she was going to, poison Homer Barron, then who knows if anybody could have stopped her. But the point is that nobody even tried. Nobody even bothered. Nobody even bothered to reach out to her at any point during her life. And now they just want to gossip and talk about her, and they have this one last little crumb that they're just drooling over to find out what's really been going on up in that bedroom. Maybe the narrator's not so cool with that. I don't know. Alright, so let's look next at the imagery. I'm not going to go through both slides. They're on slides 6 and 7. I'm not going to go through every point on them. Those are really there as references for you when it comes time to do the short story exam in week 10. I've kind of compiled a couple of slides of examples of imagery in the story. And the first slide here, slide 6, is imagery that's all about Miss Emily. And what you'll notice when you read through the list there is that certain attention is paid to certain elements of Miss Emily's appearance, what we learn about her. One thing that is significant but not super important is sort of like just her presence, her stature. And basically what we learn from the imagery is that Emily was a very proud and stern woman. Another part of the imagery, the focus of Miss Emily's imagery is on her aging process. Because the timeline is so distorted. We don't have a lot of signposts to let us know when each event is occurring. We kind of have to rely on Miss Emily's appearance to know which part of her life that event is taking place in and where it fits on the timeline. So the imagery surrounding Miss Emily is very much how her body changes as she ages, and of course how her hair changes as she ages. So that's really where that imagery is strongest. Miss Emily's imagery is one of the most important elements of the story, of figuring out the order of the events. It also helps us with some of the themes, which we'll talk about later. Slide 7 gives you a list of examples from the story that provide imagery of the Grierson house. And this is almost just as important as the imagery surrounding Miss Emily herself. And what the imagery about this house tells us is that while it once was a very grand, beautiful home that was very contemporary and very trendy and very popular during that time when it was built, it has since been neglected, and everything around it has changed. Everything in that town has become more modern, more progressive, and that house now stands out like an eyesore. It doesn't fit in. It sticks out. It's very noticeable, and because it's been neglected, it's not very pleasant to look at either. It's not just that it's outdated. And then when you go inside the house, it's even worse. Like, you can tell it hasn't been lived in. They tell us about the creaking, or the cracks in the leather, and what the narrator really focuses on through a lot of this description, a lot of this imagery, is the dust that's everywhere. And, if that much dust is settling inside a house, not much movement, there's not much going on, and nobody's cleaning it. The house on the inside is not being used at all. It's like a moment frozen in time. Because if the outside of the house has been neglected and has never been updated in any way, surely the interior of the house is the exact same. So it's like a memorial in a way, but not like a historical monument, because it hasn't been cared for. So we can't even look at it in that kind of a positive way. Like, well, it's standing as a reminder, as a symbol of the past, and we can learn so much from it. And it's like, no, nobody's going near that place. It's old, and it's been neglected, and it's probably creepy as heck. So it doesn't even serve that purpose. It's just a moment frozen in time, inside and out. And that's a pretty important idea to understand about how the house functions in the story. Alright? Miss Emily's imagery, again, focuses on her aging. So the Grierson house focuses on neglect, right? The house has remained untouched, and it's like a snapshot of the past. Miss Emily and the house both try to resist the passage of time. Like, they refuse to move forward out of that moment from the past. That leads us to the motif that we see throughout, and I've already mentioned it. Remember, a motif is like a repeated image that then gains significance, because if something is repeated, there's probably a reason why. And in this case, it's the dust, right? So I list there on slide 9 some of the specific references to dust. Some of them were also mentioned on slide 7. But just dust everywhere. every time someone goes into the Grierson house, it's part of the um, description is the dust. And time has stopped. Again, that's what the dust is telling us. Miss Emily has attempted to freeze time. And then if you get to the end, when they break open the bedroom door, obviously the focal point is the corpse on the bed. But there is a good bit of attention paid to the dust before the corpse is mentioned. And so you take that dust, which we've seen throughout the whole story anytime someone references the house, and this inability to accept that time is moving on. This neglect and this steadfast hold to the past. And then it's there at the end too. But now at the end, it's coupled with this really grotesque and macabre image of the corpse on the bed and the gray hair on the pillow next to it. And all we can really take from that is that the dust, and why the dust would be so prevalent throughout the house, that it's not a good thing. That even though we might understand why Miss Emily attempts to remain in the past, it's still very problematic. And that there's probably a lesson to be learned from that. That her inability to accept that time was moving on led to the neglect and then the very gross, tragic ending. So, trying to stay in the past, refusing to move forward, it's never going to end pretty. It's not going to be good. So, that takes us to some symbols here. We're going to have a little bit of a repeat as we get into the symbols and the setting and the atmosphere, because the structure and the point of view and the imagery are so heavy in this story. They're all so crucial. And Faulkner's not trying to dabble in a whole lot of different ideas and messages. He has a very specific purpose with this story. And it's like he is just hammering it in with every element of the story. Because our symbols first is the house again. So remember, what is a reflection of what life used to be, right? It used to be exactly what everyone would want. It's now sort of like a symbol of wealth and status and aristocracy from the previous generation, which is what the Griersons used to possess. Everything around the house has moved forward, but the house has not. It is a symbol of the past. It is also a symbol of death, literally and figuratively. It is the literal death of Homer, the figurative death of Miss Emily, because she sort of dies figuratively long before she stops breathing. Hence being shut up in the house and nobody really seeing her for 30-something years. It is also the literal death of Emily. But then it's also the figurative, it's the death of the past. That is what the house symbolizes. Miss Emily's watch, which we hear about one time, but it was a really weird detail thrown into the description of Miss Emily the day that the alderman came to visit her. And her hair. They are symbols of time. I mean, obviously a pocket watch would be a symbol of time. Right? She wears it around her neck. It is a very obvious reminder of time. And yet she wears it around her neck and refuses to acknowledge time moving forward. I wonder if she fidgets with it. I wonder if she resets it. Almost like she's trying to manipulate time, literally. There's absolutely no evidence of that. That's just me being kind of funny. But her gray hair is obviously a symbol of time as well, because the narrator makes such a point to tell us about her hair every time she is seen by somebody in the town. And if you put it all in the correct order, we can see her hair getting grayer and grayer and grayer. It also allows us to truly understand what the significance of the long strand of gray hair means on the pillow next to Homer's corpse. All of that attention paid to her hair so that we would pick up on that clue at the end. So the hair is also a little bit of foreshadowing, right? Something that you don't realize is significant in the moment, but then afterwards you realize, oh, that was sort of a preview of something to come. The hair, foreshadowing. But those are both the house and, her hair serve as really big symbols within the story. And those symbols, we'll talk about how they show up in the theme as well. But one last little area we need to talk about before we get to the themes is the setting and the atmosphere. Now remember, when we talked about setting, it was both the geographical location as well as the time period. And in this case, the time period is of uber importance because we are in the post-Civil War South. So, time and location are pretty significant, right? So we are in a fictional area of Mississippi, but it's a very accurate representation of real Mississippi at this time. So we're looking at roughly the 1860s through the 1930s, and so that's right after, actually sort of midway through the Civil War and afterwards, right? And for Southerners during this time, the end of the Civil War was not just an ending to a war, it was an ending to life as they knew it. Good, bad, or ugly, and obviously quite ugly. Whether, how do I put it? Clearly, that way of life absolutely needed to come to an end. But at the same time, can you imagine what that must have been like? I'm not saying we should sympathize with them, just that it was a huge upheaval. And we see how the town and its people changed after the war. Some struggled with letting go of the past. They struggled with moving forward. They struggled with that post-war progress that was brought to the South after the war. So Emily and the Grierson house sort of become a symbol of that, a reflection of that inability, that struggle to move forward. So we've already talked about, because part of the setting is, of course, the Grierson house itself, and so we've already talked a lot about the significance of that house. But one thing it also does is it also adds to the atmosphere. So not only is it part of the setting, not only is it a huge part of the imagery that we get throughout the story, and not only is it a symbol, but it also provides a bit of atmosphere to the story, because anytime you are talking about an old, neglected, dilapidated, run-down, creepy southern house, it is going to evoke some feelings of, mystery, and sort of a gothic atmosphere. Southern Gothic, to be exact. Which Faulkner was known as a Southern Gothic writer, so it totally makes sense. But it just adds another layer to how we're supposed to react emotionally to this story. Because no matter how much we might feel sorry for Emily, everything else around this story tells us that nothing good is coming from that house, and that there's some lessons that we should be learning from it. And that brings us to our themes on slide 12. And if you haven't guessed it yet, the biggest theme is the past and the present, that the past never truly dies. The disjointed structure takes us in and out of the past and present with no regard for linear time. Like, it's almost like Pulp Fiction. in short story form. Um, Miss Emily clings to the past. She refuses to live in the present. And because of that, tragedy ensues. Just like the South tried to cling to certain features of its past while being forced to move forward. So both Miss Emily and her sad tale are sort of examples of that struggle. So he takes that struggle that the whole South as a region was experiencing after the war, and how it was hurting them to cling so desperately to the past instead of just embracing the future and moving forward. That he saw how much it was hurting the region as a whole, and so he creates a lot of stories where the specific characters, like he takes this really big abstract picture and creates a smaller literal picture to sort of represent what he is seeing on that abstract stage. So he's seeing what's happening in the South, and he creates a little short story with with characters we can relate to and understand to show us the fault, to show us what's wrong with trying to cling to the past, so that then we can maybe apply it to the bigger, more abstract picture. Going kind of along with, the past and the present sort of intermingling, there's also the theme of death. It's almost like the story is about death and taxes. Was it Benjamin Franklin that said that? There's only two things guaranteed in life, death and taxes. This story starts off with death and taxes. But going deeper than that. It's Miss Emily's attempts to defy death. We see it with her father. She refuses to admit that he's dead. We saw it with her reference to Colonel Sartoris when the new generation of aldermen come to try to collect her taxes, start collecting her taxes again, and she keeps, demanding that they talk to Colonel Sartoris about it. And the man's been dead. Is she just sort of absent-minded, or a bit a bit of dementia or Alzheimer's in her late years? Is that why she doesn't realize? Or does she just refuse to believe that he's dead? Like she refused to admit that her father was dead. Then, of course, she totally tries to defy death with Homer. That's not all that Homer's death signifies, but it is definitely part of what we're supposed to get from her killing him. And then not just killing him, but putting him on the bed and sleeping next to him for 40-some years. She's trying to defy death, because death is obviously a natural byproduct of the past changing into the present, right? If you can stop time, can you stop death? The answer is no. You cannot, no matter how hard she tries. So we witnessed the figurative death of Emily long before her literal death. And despite her efforts to defy the passage of time, and despite her efforts to deny the inevitability of death. And all of that comes through when you look at the structure, the imagery and the symbolism, the point of view, and the setting and the atmosphere. You just have to sort of get through the structure of it. But, hopefully you guys are forgiving of that, because while it makes it really crazy to read, it was actually quite a genius move on Faulkner's part. Because not only did it allow the mystery to, continue strong throughout the story, but it even more so helps highlight this whole ordeal, this whole dilemma between the past and the present, and those who cling too hard to the past and refuse to move forward, as he saw the South. attempting to do. So, that's a rose for Emily. Um, if you have any questions or anything you want to discuss further about the information, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a better understanding of the story now and what we were supposed to sort of get out of it. And you guys are free to move on to the next thing.